Okay, so we left off taking a look at this chart that was kind of visually representing what we refer to in sociology as the gender wage gap, right? So this reality that women in virtually every occupation in the United States make less money in comparison to men. So from a sociological perspective, we might ask, well, why does this pattern of human behavior exist, right? This does not seem like some anomaly, right? This is not just a random occurrence or one existence of this happening. Virtually every occupation, women are getting paid less than men. So how can we explain this pattern of human behavior? Well, from a conflict theorist perspective, we might ask, why or how do men get more power in the social structure of the workforce, right? What is it about the social structure of gender that affords them more power in comparison to women that would enable them to maintain this advantage or this privilege in the workforce, despite the fact that women have been able to enter the paid workforce for many years now? Well, we might start thinking about some policies that are in place in the workforce that would disadvantage women or give men a leg up, right? So off the top of our heads, we might think, well, what about maternity leave, right? In the United States, it's largely expected for only women, but not necessarily men, to take time off of work after they have a child. Now, some people might say, well, typically it's the women who have the babies, so they should get the time off work. But in countries around the world, it's fairly common for both men and women to get to take time off of work once they have a child. Not just women like it is in the United States. And now what studies consistently have found in the field of sociology is that because women disproportionately take more time off of work than men after the birth of the child, they experience what's called a motherhood penalty. Women with children, in comparison to women without children, are less likely to be considered for promotions, they are less likely to be considered for raises, and men with children, interestingly, are actually more likely to be considered for promotions and raises in comparison to men without children. So not only is there a motherhood penalty, there's actually a fatherhood premium, right? So it's these unique systems of disadvantage that afford certain privileges or scarce resources to some groups over others that result in social inequalities. And that's what conflict theory is really interested in understanding. They use this lens to understand how power gets unequally distributed to groups in society. They question who has power and who doesn't. And they also question how people with power work to enable or build social structures in our society that enable them to maintain that power. Talking about a little bit about conflict theory and social change. If you remember back to our previous video lecture, we said that functionalism really emphasizes stability. On the flip side of that, conflict theory really emphasizes change, right? Since conflict theory is all about identifying these inequalities, how power and scarce resources are unequally distributed across different groups, they heavily emphasize the need for social change in order to achieve human equality. Right? So according to this theory, society is constantly in conflict over scarce resources, which drives this need for social change. Whenever there's oppressed groups of people that are feeling like they're being disadvantaged, right? In this case, thinking about women in the workforce, change often comes about by people who are fighting to get what they think they deserve, right? So it comes about through competing interests, not necessarily by consensus or slow adaptations, as structural functionalists would say change occurs by. And good examples of these kind of abrupt needs for social change are evidenced in the civil rights movement, the Me Too movement, the Black Lives Matter movement, right? These are collective efforts by predominantly marginalized communities, so communities that do not have or are not afforded a lot of power in society, and they're collectively mobilizing and working, trying to change these social structures to more equitably distribute scarce resources, whether that's money or opportunities of some kind, what have you. Critiques of conflict theory. Conflict theory is oftentimes so focused on social change and what needs to be done to achieve equality that it neglects the stability of society. Again, social structures in general, very durable. They're very difficult to change, and that's because they are deeply ingrained within the fabric of society. Much social change occurs through minor increments, gradually shifting social structures step by step over extended periods of time rather than in the form of abrupt revolutions, right? It's not like racism is a brand new social problem. It's something that's been negatively impacting our society since it was conceptualized over 400 years ago. Yet still today, we have things like the Black Lives Matter movement that are fighting for some of the basic civil liberties that the civil rights movement about 50 years ago was fighting for. So oftentimes, social change is very slow and incremental. It doesn't just necessarily change overnight. All right, moving on to the last of the big three sociological theories, and that is symbolic interactionism. All right. So if I asked you what this is a picture of, what would you say? I'm assuming that the vast majority of you would say, well, it's obviously a heart, right? Well, yes and no. This is actually a picture of a heart, right? So the image on the left is actually a symbol of what we as Americans have decided a heart looks like, for whatever reasons, whether it was just easier to draw than what an actual heart looks like, or if it's not as gross or gruesome, or if it was more simplistic for the Valentine's Day Corporation to just say this is what a heart is. We as a society have collectively established this shared understanding that this image on the left is a heart. If you see this, you automatically think that's a heart, right? It's a symbol of love, of caring, of commitment, right? And so it's really interesting how this simple image on the left, which really doesn't look a whole lot like the actual thing, has become this kind of universal symbol that we, as members of the United States, as this society, collectively understand the meaning of it and the symbolism of it. So that's kind of the basis of symbolic interactionism in a nutshell. Through centuries of interacting with other individuals, our society has socially constructed a shared system of language and symbols that allow us to assign meanings to things, that allow us to communicate with one another, and that allows us to share information with one another, right? Social life is built on human interaction, right? This is pretty much a founding principle of symbolic interactionism. Without the ability to interact with other humans, without the ability to communicate with other humans, we as a species would cease to exist, right? There's no way we could come to know and understand the things we need to know and understand in order to survive in our society without human interaction. So that's a really powerful thought here that symbolic interaction offers us. The roles, the norms, the expectations of human life that of all people in any society, they don't merely just exist, right? The norms of a society didn't just pop out of thin air. We as people socially constructed them. We gave them meaning, and we gave them meaning through interactions, right? I wasn't born knowing that this image on the left here is a heart, right? I was probably taught that maybe when I was, 3 or 4 years old, when I was coloring with my mom or one of my sisters. They probably taught me how to draw a heart, and they told me, here, this means I love you, right? That was a learned behavior. I learned that information through interacting with another social being, okay? So as a society, we assign meaning into interactions, to objects, to virtually everything. And we teach other people to interpret those interactions in that same way. And it's this kind of collective or shared understanding of different symbols, different words, different objects that allows us to exist as a society, allows us to communicate with others. It allows us essentially to survive, right? Symbolic interactionism suggests that since the meanings we assign to different symbols, beliefs, and behaviors are socially constructed, they also vary a lot from society to society. So a great example of this is a thumbs up. If I asked you, what does a thumbs up mean here in the United States? You'd probably say, oh, good job, or nice work, something along those lines. Well, in a number of countries in the Middle East, a thumbs up actually means F you. Right? So that's a really interesting distinction here. This is a symbol for something good and pleasant in our society, but in another society, they may have a socially constructed meaning that is completely different. And that's a really good example here because it's just about as polar opposite as it could be, this versus this, right? So, a good example about how symbols are socially constructed differently in all societies, because the people in any given society get to decide how they want to label things, how they want to assign meanings to things. Another great example of this is that many societies have different languages, right? We communicate very differently depending on where we live, where we were raised. And that's another attribute that societies and social structures are socially constructed. All right, a lot of text on this slide. I apologize, but you can definitely read through this verbatim here. I'm just going to come back to our example of gender as a social structure, and this time look at it through the lens of symbolic interactionism. So symbolic interactionism would argue that the meaning and the power that gender holds as a social structure is socially constructed by members of that society. When people choose to follow the norms or beliefs endorsed by the structure of gender, they are reinforcing that structure, right? So every morning that I wake up and I adhere to the gender norms of masculinity, since I identify as male, every time I adhere to the gender norms of masculinity, every time I present myself as a man, every time I use the men's restroom out in public, I am reinforcing the social structure of gender because I'm buying into those symbols and the representations of what we as a society collectively have agreed it means to be a man. When people, particularly groups of people, choose to challenge or go against the norms endorsed by the structure of gender, they could potentially change, or we could say socially reconstruct, the social structure of gender to make it something different. So a great example of this was the suffrage movement, right? When hundreds, thousands of women agreed that the social structure of gender was problematic in the United States, that it was disadvantaging women by denying them the right to vote, they mobilized and they actively worked through protesting, through political advancements to reconstruct how gender operated within their society. They socially reconstructed what gender was. They changed what gender meant in their society. Gender no longer meant that if you were a woman, you couldn't vote. All of a sudden, they were able to achieve this social change, which meant that your gender did not play a factor in determining whether or not you had the right to vote, right? However, it's also important to note that choosing to go against a social structure is a risk, remember, because social structures, they're very durable, they're typically widely supported by society, so people who choose to challenge a social structure could face being stigmatized or marginalized, outcast by society. And again, we definitely saw this in the suffrage movement. A number of suffragettes were treated like pariahs in their communities, not only by men, but also by women who supported the current structure of gender at that time. That's another really important takeaway from this. Like I said in a previous presentation, social structures run deep and they run hard, right? It wasn't that every woman was fighting for the right to vote. Some women agreed that they shouldn't have the right to vote, right? Which might sound really wild to us today, like why wouldn't a woman want the right to vote? But you have to remember, at that point in time during history, that social structure of gender was so deeply embedded within society that many women were satisfied. They felt complacent, accepting that their place was in home, that they didn't have a place in politics, that they shouldn't have a voice in voting, because that was, again, what they were socialized into. That was the social structure that they were taught was normal from the day that they were born, right? So social structures are very deeply embedded into society, but they are socially constructed, meaning that we, the members of society, give them meaning, and that we also, as members of that society, have the potential to change them if we're able to mobilize an effective movement. Typically, one person is not enough to change a social structure, but every social movement, every collective act of mobilization started with one person, right? So it's got to start somewhere, but it often takes a collective movement of multiple individuals to effectively change a social structure. Wrapping things up here, symbolic interactionism recognizes that the labeling of certain groups as privileged or marginalized is socially constructed. Therefore, systems of inequality like racism, sexism, and homophobia are also socially constructed. Since humans give meaning to and created these systems of inequality, we could also change them. The power to change the meaning and value of social groups lies heavily within individuals. So this is very much an individual-focused theory. It recognizes that every individual is constantly interacting with people, and every interaction that we have with someone else has the ability to cause them to think differently about different social dynamics, different social structures in our society. Critiques really quickly here. The theory focuses so much on power of individuals that they fail to recognize the power of structures. So yeah, we'll leave it at this here. I'm running out of time for this 15-minute video, but we'll pick things up next.